Trump wants to stop Russia's war against Ukraine, but what difficulties will he face? Why must he genuinely engage with Ukraine and the EU to achieve this goal? What leverage does he have to encourage Putin to negotiate? Why does any peace in this context need to be sustainable? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. Explaining Ukraine is a podcast by Ukraine World, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of Ukraine World and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Fredrik Wesslau, a Swedish diplomat and analyst who has worked for many years in Ukraine. Wesslau is currently a senior advisor at Rasmussen Global and a distinguished policy fellow at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. Until December 2022, he served in Kyiv as deputy head of the EU advisory mission to Ukraine. Ukraine World is produced by Internet Ukraine, one of the country's largest media NGOs. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We offer exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines of this war via PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Fredrik Wesslau, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to have you here in Kyiv, and there is a snow outside, so we have winter in Kyiv. And we are making this podcast in a premises of PEN Ukraine without electricity. So we don't have any electricity. But you come quite often to Kyiv, and your life has big connections with Ukraine. Can you tell me more about this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I try to come to Kyiv every 3 months. I was last here in September, and then before that in July. I lived in Kyiv for 4.5 years with my family. I was working as the deputy head of the EU advisory mission here until December 2022. So I spent most of the first year of the war, the full-scale invasion, in Kyiv as well. And after that, I moved back to Stockholm, where I'm from, but still work on Ukraine in various capacities. And so I try to come every so often.
What would you say to people who are afraid to come to Ukraine? Because there are so many governments actually make restrictions, for example, to come to Ukraine, don't open their offices here, the offices of their institutions. I know that, for example, in French universities, for a French scholar of Ukraine, he or she cannot come on the mission of the university to come here, because it will be considered as a private visit otherwise, because the university cannot allow to come to Ukraine. What would you say to such people?
Well, look, I mean, Ukraine is a country at war, of course, so there is a certain risk to being in Kyiv. I mean, Russia carries out missile attacks, drone raids, but at the same time, I think one needs to have a sort of a reasonable approach to this. And the risk of actually being wounded or killed in Kyiv is very small. There's probably a greater risk of being hit by a car than actually being the victim of something. So I think often it's quite exaggerated. And once you come here, you realize that life goes on. Schools are open, restaurants are open, jobs, people go to work. Life goes on. And it's also the normality in Kyiv is a form of defiance as well, I would say. Despite the hardship, despite Russia's aggression, people with pride want to go on living as they did before.
That's one of my formulas of Ukraine. This is a country of despite, the freedom despite tyranny and life despite death. So let me now address to one of the latest articles you wrote for Foreign Policy. You wrote it in late November. And this is it's a reflection about possible Trump-Putin negotiations, the peace negotiations. And you analyze in quite detail what can be the obstacles and what can be the difficulties of these negotiations. Given the development of the latest even days, What is your argument about what will be happening probably after or even before the Trump's inauguration?
Well, I mean, during the campaign, Trump repeated over and over and over again that he would solve the war, he would end the fighting within 24 hours, even before he was inaugurated. In typical character, he gave no details of how he would actually do this, of course, but this was his sort of talking point over and over again. Many of his close advisors and not so close advisors presented various ideas and plans on how to do this. But now he won the elections, of course, and so everybody, I feel, is in a bit of a waiting mode to see, what does the Trump administration do. And yes, I think they might actually take steps even before Trump is inaugurated in January. And I do think that he wants to end the war, but that's not so straightforward. I think, and it might very well be that members of his team are actually even now talking to Moscow to see what can be done. But I think, first of all, it's extremely difficult for Trump to reach some sort of a deal with Putin for a few different reasons, which I can go into later. But even if they do reach some sort of an understanding, it's not obvious that the Ukrainians will sign up to it, or the Europeans even. And then the question is, what does a deal between Putin and Trump mean that doesn't include the Ukrainians and the Europeans?
That's very interesting, because this is one of the arguments of your article. You're saying basically that the deal which does not take into account Europe as a whole and Ukraine as a part of it will not work. But this is precisely what Putin dreams about. He's dreaming about lessening or destroying not even the subjectivity of Ukrainians, but also the subjectivity and agency of Europeans. And Trump is also showing that he would do his politics in a way that America first, and America can make deals with Russia on its own. But why do you think that this deal will not be viable if it doesn't take into account what Ukrainians think and other Europeans think?
But let's go back a little bit first to the question of whether a deal is likely or even possible, in a sense, between Trump and Putin. I mean, if you take what Putin's stated objectives are, and I tend to think that his objectives are much more expansive and imperialist than what he actually says in public. I think he wants to destroy the Ukrainian state and nation, quite frankly, and sort of restore the Russian Empire. But, he talks about denazification, demilitarization, and neutrality for Ukraine. I mean, denazification is basically code for decapitating the government in Kyiv, and installing somebody who is loyal or under the control of Moscow. Secondly, there's disarming Ukraine, putting severe limitations on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, the types of weapons they can have, and so on. And then finally, neutrality. This means, I think in his mind, having some sort of international treaty that guarantees Ukraine's neutrality, and of course, prevents any form of association with NATO, let alone NATO membership. So, on the first point, denazification, I mean, I don't see Trump being able to even agree to this, and it would be a bit foolish, and it's not really in his power as well to say, okay, the government in Kyiv is illegitimate and will, support somebody else. Secondly, on disarming Ukraine, I think, the Trump team understands that this would, be suicide in a sense. This would just open up for Russia to completely conquer Ukraine. So it's not a very, sort of sustainable option. And then on neutrality, even though, and I think this might be possible, the Trump administration may go out and say, the U.S. position is that we do not support NATO membership for Ukraine. If the other allies don't agree with this, it doesn't fundamentally change NATO's position, which is, going back to the Bucharest summit, that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. You need unanimity to sort of change that, to sort of say Ukraine will no longer have a NATO membership perspective. So, there's sort of limits to how much they can actually accomplish. Then, of course, it's very possible that a Trump administration, in trying to secure support for such a deal, would put pressure on the Europeans, for instance, by threatening to withdraw US troops from Europe, by sort of undermining the credibility of Article 5, which he did to some extent during the first Trump administration, and also with Ukrainians, of course, withholding military assistance. So levers, in a sense, to put pressure on both Europeans and Ukrainians. But at the same time, I think for Ukrainians, this war is existential. Yes, people are tired after nearly 3 years of war, but the will to fight is still very strong. Ukrainian defense production is increasing as well. Yes, I think Ukraine is still very dependent on US military assistance, of course, especially the more sophisticated types of weapons and ATACMS and HIMARS and the sort of the long distance missiles. But at the same time, Europe can to some extent compensate for that, and the Ukrainians can to some extent compensate for that as well. So it's not as straightforward as Putin and Trump coming to an agreement and then forcing the Europeans and the Ukrainians to just sign up to this deal.
But then the question is how you force Putin to the negotiation table, right? Because the debate in the America, sometimes I look at it and I just find it very strange, because the debate is, okay, we help too much Ukraine, let's withdraw this assistance, and some of people like Musk, or I don't know, some others are saying, okay, but Zelensky is a beggar, we will not give money to him anymore, as if it is Ukrainians who keep this war going, as if you stop Ukraine, everything will be fine. But the problem is different. The problem is how you stop Russia, because it's Russia who started the war, who wants to continue the war, and who is now on the offensive. You make several arguments in your article also about weapons delivery, more weapons delivery, oil, question of oil, which is very important. Can you develop on that?
Yeah, I think exactly. I mean, there's a big question around whether Russia wants to negotiate. I think from their perspective, despite financial pressures, they think that they're winning. They're making progress. So their incentive to negotiate may not be that strong, especially if they think that in the future they might have a stronger negotiation position. And so I think that when the Trump team approaches Moscow, they may run into a wall. Lack of interest in any negotiations, and also demands which are so sort of outlandish, so not even the Trump administration could sort of accept them. So if this is the case, then you could very well see the Trump administration sort of raising the costs on Russia. And it's interesting because Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, he's floated this idea about increasing production of oil in the US. And I think, the Trump economic team is also thinking about this together with the Saudis, not primarily against, this is not meant to be against Russia, but more about boosting the US economy in a sense, a very sort of populist measure. But it would have the consequence of putting even more economic pressure on Russia. Then there's also, the notion of putting pressure on a Russia that does not want to negotiate by increasing military assistance to Ukraine as well, in order to sort of stabilize the front line. And I think this is interesting with Trump because he's quite unpredictable. And so, the Trump people, they like to make the case. Now the electricity has come back on here.
We have.
The Trump people, they like to make the case that Trump was the one who gave javelins to Ukrainians, while Obama did not do so in a sense. So I think there is something to that, and both Waltz and also Kellogg, who is the U.S. Incoming Ukraine envoy. I mean, both of these guys are military men. I think they understand military power. They understand battlefield dynamics. They understand that, the battlefield will determine the negotiations, not what happens in the negotiation room necessarily. Yeah. So, I think you can see a scenario where, again, the Russians do not want to negotiate, which leads the Trump administration to increase the pressure on Russia through gas, maybe through sanctions as well, hard-hitting sanctions, and maybe through increasing military assistance to Ukraine.
Okay, and the question is, for me as well, is that when we see the discourse in the West that, okay, we cannot sustain this war, let's negotiate, but there is so many still leverage on Russia, and particularly in the economic field. Like the question of how Russia is actually filling its budget, how it's forming its budget, it's all depending on oil. And it's one of the most weakest points because there are so many news that Russian tankers are going here and there and continue to export oil. And we see that Russian economy is not that in a fantastic shape. So do you think there is still room to use economic measures as well to influence Russia?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's so much more that we can do when it comes to sanctions, for instance. I mean, there's the cap on the price of oil, for instance. I mean, that could be lowered. Some European countries are still buying Russian gas, right? And also through Turkey, through Azerbaijan, through India, it's very disingenuous in a sense. So on the one hand, we're seizing Russian state assets and imposing sanctions, but at the same time we're sending billions to Russia, to the Russian economy, which feeds the war, of course. So I think our leverage is actually massive, but we're still very cautious in the West about really using it to its full potential.
Let's come back to this question of negotiations, and let's imagine that Trump tells Ukraine and Europeans that, okay, we should say no to Ukraine's NATO membership. We should fix it somewhere. We should sign a treaty. And then you say in your articles that, look, NATO has a policy of open doors. So can NATO really say that? Can NATO, especially after you refer to Bucharest summit of 2008, right? If I'm not mistaken, which had very ambiguous results. Ukrainians were very unhappy, but then some people in the West say that it is precisely that the summit said that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO, which provoked Russia, which I don't agree with. I think that what provoked Russia is precisely this lack of clarity about this NATO membership. So do you think it's even possible, or it will create a crisis within the NATO?
Look, I think it will cause a massive debate among allies in NATO, but I think that a big majority of allies will be very opposed to the pure principle of it, to somehow admit formally on paper that Russia can somehow veto this, that we impose neutrality on a third party. When Finland decided to join NATO, it was very much because Russia sort of demanded, in a sense, that their non-aligned status would be, codified in a way, that the option of joining NATO should be formally excluded in a way, and this put them in an impossible position, and then Sweden sort of followed thereafter. So I think the open door policy, even if one can, I think, rightly question how open it's actually been in practice since 2008, because there was a promise that was made in Bucharest, but that hasn't been lived up to, and we haven't sort of moved down that avenue really. But still, the principle is still very important for many allies.
And there is also a big question: people there is a big debate always. The people like Jeffrey Sachs who are saying that, look, it's all about NATO expansion, that Russia reacted to the NATO expansion and NATO provoked Russia. While, of course, our argument in Ukraine and in many other countries that joined NATO in 1990s and 2000s was, look, it was not really, we were willing to join NATO precisely because of the Russian threat. It's not that joining NATO created the Russian threat. It's a Russian threat created joining NATO and created the NATO expansion. And then you're living in Sweden, and we've seen this enlargement, latest enlargement, and Russia did not have any reaction on that. It seems that, well, it doesn't really care about NATO expansion. It has Finland and Sweden on its borders and doesn't really care, and it continues the war against Ukraine, who is formally neutral. I mean, it's not part of the bloc. So how would you? This is a very important argument, a very important debate, because even if there are negotiations, if we don't have the big security part, security guarantees part, NATO membership or bilateral agreements between America and Ukraine, UK and Ukraine, Sweden and Ukraine, you name it, we will have continuation of this war indefinitely. What would you say?
Look, I think this is the sort of one of the crucial questions for sure. Russia does not like NATO, not because NATO is a threat to Russia, but because NATO is a threat to Russian imperialism and its imperial ambitions in Ukraine, in Georgia. So, if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, it would prevent Russia from pursuing its imperial ambitions. I think this is how you should see it. I mean, the notion that NATO provoked Russia, I think, is completely absurd. And I mean, Jeffrey Sachs' line is really way out there in a sense. But this gets back to possible negotiations and to a possible solution as well. I think it was very interesting with President Zelensky the other week when he gave this interview to Sky News, where he, I think for the first time, sort of floated the idea of NATO membership with sort of partial application of Article 5. And sort of a commitment to not retake the occupied territories by force. And this is a little bit the West German model that's been floated in various discussions. And, now, obviously, there's been a long-standing debate, and Kyiv has been pushing hard for an invitation to become a member of NATO. Some big allies, including the US and Germany, have been quite sort of opposed to this because they think it's too sort of escalatory. But I think it still has to be sort of part of any solution. And if you look at Sweden and Finland, I mean, it's extremely interesting. Like you say, this was a reversal of a policy of decades and centuries for Sweden, actually. But the conclusion that was drawn in February 2022 was that this gray zone between Russia and NATO was no longer safe. The risk of being invaded by Russia was unacceptably high. And even EU membership was not enough, because obviously Sweden and Finland weren't our members of the EU. So in Finland and Sweden, there was a massive shift towards joining NATO, because that was seen as the only guarantee against Russian aggression. And like you say, it was quite interesting with the Russian reaction. There was some heated rhetoric, implicit threats, but this was nothing new in the case of Finland and Sweden. Russia had been, rattling its saber for many years, actually. But in actual fact, they didn't really do anything towards Finland and Russia. And now, it really is a massive strategic defeat for Russia to suddenly have Finland and Sweden as members of NATO, because before February 2022, that was never really a realistic prospect.
Yeah, and this is kind of the argument that I quite often express to people who are skeptical about Ukraine's NATO membership, because they're saying, okay, we don't want a war between NATO and Russia. We don't want a third world war. I also don't want the World War III, obviously. But my argument is that, okay, if you are afraid of Russia attacking a NATO member country and drawing NATO into a big war, you should be preparing to better defend the Baltic countries, Finland, because, well, sooner or later, when Russia will see that it is not successful in Ukraine or not successful enough, it will be probably attacking the Baltic states because, frankly speaking, they're much more vulnerable in terms of defense. But if you think that NATO membership is a guarantee, and if you think that Russia will never attack the Baltic states or Finland because they are members of NATO, then you should take Ukraine into NATO because it will end the war. It will provide a sustainable peace solution. What is your reaction to this argument?
Well, look, I think the challenge is to sort of explain the how. How can Ukraine become a member of NATO, and how would this lead to war termination? How is the process of becoming a member a way to de-escalate rather than to escalate? Because, the argument you get is, if you make Ukraine a member of NATO today, it will immediately lead to World War III, right? But I think it's important to, from a nearly a pedagogical point of view, just explain how the process could look, in a sense, to show, how we get from today to membership and war termination. I think, first of all, issuing an invitation is essentially cost-free for NATO because it doesn't entail any sort of legally binding security guarantee. It's free, right? It doesn't cost NATO anything. But it would be an extremely strong signal to Moscow, basically to say that, look, you don't have a veto over Ukraine's membership of NATO. And it would be a massive boost to Ukraine, especially, if we end up in negotiations. But I also think what you need is not only an invitation, but also the start of an accession process. And this accession process should go sort of in parallel with an offer for negotiations with Russia, without precondition. Because if you have these parallel processes, the NATO accession process and peace negotiations running in parallel, they could feed into each other and they would strengthen Ukraine's position. And the question is, why would Russia, as we spoke before, why would Russia even take part in such negotiations? Well, they may take part in such negotiations and try in order to try to influence the accession process and try to sort of, put limits on the number of NATO troops that can be deployed to Ukraine, get agreement on no nuclear weapons in Ukraine, for instance. No NATO exercises in Ukraine. So I think there is a sort of a complex but still workable parallel process, which is both accession process and the negotiations, which would eventually lead to peace termination, to a ceasefire, possibly a peace agreement, but also Ukraine's membership of NATO. One of the key questions is, of course, Article 5, right? How do you implement Article 5 when 20% of Ukrainian territory is under Russian occupation, and you have a very fluid front line as well. I think you probably need to stabilize the front line, and the way to do this is to give more weapons to Ukraine, of course, so they can sort of hold the line. And then I think it's also to, as part of the accession process, to really define the functional and geographic limitations on Article 5. So you could say that it applies to the west of an axis, for instance, running from Kharkiv to Dnipro to Kherson, for instance, or Mykolaiv. And also you need to sort of deal with the continued missile and drone attacks. How does NATO relate to that when it comes to Article 5? Does it trigger Article 5, or is that below the threshold? Or how do you sort of deal with that sort of thing? So there as well, you would probably need to beef up Ukraine's air defenses as well, to show to Russia that these drone and missile attacks have no real benefit in a sense. As well, and then also, to build up Ukrainian long strike capacity as well to sort of balance the military power here. So I think, at the end of the day, you need to have these sort of two processes, and at the end of it, Ukraine will become a member of NATO with this sort of geographic limitation on Article 5, and that will sort of secure the Kyiv-controlled areas of Ukraine. But also, NATO membership should be for all of Ukraine as well, including the occupied territories. I think that's a very important point of principle as well, that we in the West don't sort of accept Russia's annexation of these territories as well, but that we sort of say, okay, look, reunification, we're committed to it, it will happen, but it will take time. And this is a little bit, again, the sort of the West Germany model from 1955.
There are several difficulties in this. One of them is that there is a big question of the border, right? Because there are two questions related to the border and the border or demarcation line. And they will, of course, appear in any peace negotiations. The first question is how actually you demarcate it. Because in Germany, it was much more easier, because there were occupation zones and they were kind of demarcated by the balance of forces. And this balance of forces, this power that created this balance of power, these powers were not enemies, they were allies, right? Here we have a different situation because there are enemies. And the front line is more or less stabilized, but Russians are, offensing and continuing it. So this is the question, and how you ensure that this line is not broken. Look at Georgia, for example. Russians, even the war is over for many years, but Russians are getting more and more territories from Georgia, even if not those who are occupied. This is the first question. So you need to have some troops there, some peacekeepers or whatever, NATO peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, I don't know. The second question is that the broader one, because for Russia, according to Russian constitution, there are lots of territories which it declared as Russian, which are controlled by Ukraine. The two big cities, Kherson and Zaporizhia, we just returned from Kherson yesterday. 300,000 people before the full-scale invasion. It's a big city. It was taken by the Russians, and then Russians lost it 2 years ago. Zaporizhia, they haven't even taken it, but they said all the Zaporizhia Oblast, all the Kherson Oblast are actually Russian territories according to Russian constitution. So they might say, we will not stop the war until we get these cities. And, it can continue for years and years and years, because look at what Russians gained in this year. They just gained two small regional centers, not even the oblast centers, regional. No, it's rayon centers, what we call, so the smaller cities. What would you reply to that? Do you think Russians are serious about saying that Zaporizhia is a Russian city, or they can drop it and say, well, okay, let's freeze the line here?
Look, I think they've shown that they're quite pragmatic in practice when it comes to this. This sort of revising the constitution was a big political show. But in practice, I mean, they didn't control all of the oblast territory, right? So it was a fiction to some extent. And I mean, they've also shown that there is a big difference between attacking, or when Ukraine attacks Crimea, or when it attacks Donbass, or when it attacks the occupied territories of Zaporizhia or Kherson, or when it strikes inside Kursk, for instance, or so. I think that they've shown a real differentiation between these different territories. I think revising the Russian constitution was a big political signal, but in practice it didn't really mean anything.
Let's think, because what Russians are actually saying right now. They're saying we want all the Zaporizhia Oblast, and that would. What does it mean in practice? I mean, I just imagine when Trump comes and say, because from the statements of the Trump team, it's like it shows that some of them do not understand really anything, because when they say Ukraine should give up Crimea, well, the problem is that Russians have annexed 4 more Ukrainian territories, and from the Russian legal point of view, there is no difference between Zaporizhia, which has never been under Russian occupation, and Crimea, which is under Russian occupation for 10 years. But let me ask you a question. We discussed it in our previous episode with you. Imagine that NATO is a no-go. Imagine that there is a ban on NATO membership from United States and Germany, and there are negotiations without putting NATO on the table. There is a big question how you make this peace, even if Ukraine loses de facto some of the territories, how you make this peace sustainable. So you need some security guarantees. Are there any other options? Are there any alternative options? We discussed this with you about security agreements, bilateral security agreements. What do you think?
Look, I think there are a few things that you can do. Obviously, nothing compares to NATO membership in Article 5, but still, there are things that can be done to really raise the costs for Russia and have a sort of deterrence effect on them. I think, first of all, we have the bilateral security agreements. This stems from the Kyiv Security Compact of the summer of 2022, where the head of the presidential administration, under Yermak, and the former Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, developed this concept, and that turned into these bilateral security agreements. These are 10-year agreements. I think there are 27 such agreements now, mostly with NATO members, but not only. And they're very comprehensive agreements that cover military assistance, but also sanctions and reconstruction and intelligence sharing and a host of different areas where these countries commit to supporting Ukraine over the long term, in a sense. And they're quite powerful, these agreements, if you read them. So I think there's that. There's a sort of the long-term commitment by Ukraine's partners in the West to keep on supporting Ukraine. Then secondly, there are ideas about, in case of a ceasefire or a stabilization of the line, to deploy European troops as a sort of a tripwire or a deterrence force, for instance, along a contact line. I think also, there are other things you can do to put more skin in the game, in a sense, because I think it really is about putting more skin in the game. One idea is to have frontline states like Poland and Romania, with the support of France, UK, US, others, to shoot down Russian drones and missiles over Ukrainian territory that are approaching NATO. So this would actually be a sort of a act of self-defense, in a sense, to sort of shoot them down before they hit something inside NATO territory and potentially trigger Article 5. So I think something like that would show a much greater security commitment from the West and would add to the pressure, in a sense, on Russia. So there are many things that can actually be done. And then also, I think you mentioned as well, lifting the restrictions on long, deep strikes, for instance, as well. There's several European states who are fine with this. And the US lifted it to some extent as well. So, that's also something that can be done to really, shift the military balance in a way and help Ukraine. Because Ukraine has, in so many instances, received Western assistance, but also been restricted in using this assistance full out. So Ukraine has been fighting with one hand tied behind his back, essentially. Yeah.
Yes, and I do think that this question, how to make sure that Russia cannot continue this war or cannot restart this war, is a bit out of the table. So people are not really going to the core of the question. They're really focusing on ceasefire, whether Ukraine will, reject its territories right now. The question today is not whether Ukraine will reject or accept that the territories are occupied. We are now not in the dynamics of getting them, militarily back. Therefore, it's a question still very far from the reality. The real question is how to stop Russia. Let me maybe ask you the final question. There are now several events that probably are changing the picture completely. One of them is the Georgian protests. So we see that despite the fact that Georgia is a much smaller country and that the Georgian government tried to intimidate people that look, Russia is big, we should not, quarrel with Russia. And under this rhetorics create this horrible tyrannical laws. On the one hand, Georgian people are, showing that they are really wanting to repeat the success of Ukrainian Euromaidan revolution. Second thing is, of course, Syria, which shows that how fragile autocracies are, incredibly fragile, and that Russia is really very, very, weak and is not able even to defend its big allies on which it poured so many resources. And the third thing is the Romanian election, where the Constitutional Court was so decisive to say that no, this is a hybrid war from Russia, and we just annul the first tour, which is unprecedented, I think. Do you think that all these things show that Russia is much weaker than it seems?
I think it is. And I think we should not forget that Russia is on the defensive everywhere, in a sense. And I think its aggression against Ukraine is also, in a sense, defensive. It feels like it's losing, in a sense. So it needs to sort of lash out. I mean, same in Georgia, same in Moldova, same in Armenia. And now in Syria, I mean, this is a massive strategic defeat for Russia in the Middle East. Their main sort of ally there, except for Iran, I mean, Assad is no more, right? And the question is whether the Russian bases there can continue to exist. And this is very, very questionable. I think it's interesting, a couple of months ago, I don't think many would have predicted what happened in Syria. And like you say, these dictatorships are strong on the one hand, but also very brittle as well. And, what happened to Assad, it makes me think a little bit about Yanukovych in 2014 as well. How from one day to the next, his security structures just disappeared. The people, the Siloviki, the security guys, they just ran off because they felt like, this was it. And then he had to flee. And I often think about, when Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, marched towards Moscow as well. I mean, in Moscow, every Siloviki for a few hours must have been thinking, okay, do I stick with Putin or do I, pack my bags and leave? And I think this is the challenge that dictatorships have, that yes, they may have a lot of power through oppression, but they can unravel very quickly as well, and in very unpredictable ways.
Yes, because sometimes we have this impression that democracies are weak, and it is really so. Democracies are weak worldwide, and Russia is playing on them. But we forget that autocracies are very weak too, because if they're maintained only through fear and not through personal investment into some bigger cause, then everything will be destroyed very quickly, because people are just not identifying themselves with this power.
But I think one of the challenges that we have in democracies like Ukraine, like Moldova, and elsewhere, is where Russia sort of weaponizes the institutions of democracy against us. They instrumentalize the open societies that we have in order to undermine them. And I don't think that we in these democratic countries have really figured out how to counter this in a good way. And this is, everything from disinformation and propaganda and, TikTok in Romania and buying votes and setting up fake political parties and so on. And our strength is also our weakness in a sense, and this is but I think maybe this is the nature of our open societies, and that's worth protecting as well.
Exactly. Fredrik Wesslau, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by Ukraine World, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of Ukraine World and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest was Fredrik Wesslau, a Swedish diplomat and analyst who has worked for many years in Ukraine. Ukraine World is produced by Internews Ukraine, one of the country's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We offer exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.